I never imagined that a single phone call would transform me from a struggling warehouse worker into the owner of a $2 billion cattle empire. But when my grandfather left me everything, my siblings showed up with an army of lawyers, determined to take what they believed was rightfully theirs. What they didn't know was that my grandfather had been preparing for this moment for years, and he'd left me more than just land and money. He'd left me the truth about our family, documented in ways they never could have anticipated. I was organizing boxes in the back of a distribution warehouse when my phone buzzed in my pocket. The number had a Montana area code, somewhere I hadn't been since I was 11 years old. For some reason, I answered. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Patricia Reynolds, an attorney from Billings. She said she needed to speak with me about my grandfather, Samuel Blackwood. Her next words made my knees weak. I'm very sorry to inform you that your grandfather passed away 4 days ago. The funeral is tomorrow, and there are urgent matters regarding his estate that require your immediate attention. I leaned against a stack of pallets, trying to process what I just heard. Grandpa Samuel. I hadn't seen him since my parents packed us up and moved to California without warning. They'd told me he didn't want us around anymore, that he'd become cruel and heartless in his old age. The memory of that sudden departure still stung, even after all these years. I remembered crying myself to sleep for weeks, not understanding why Grandpa didn't want me anymore. My parents had been adamant that we could never go back, that he'd made his feelings perfectly clear. Ms. Reynolds continued speaking, her voice professional but not unkind. I know this must be shocking, especially given the circumstances of your family's departure from Montana, but there's something you need to understand. Your grandfather never stopped looking for you. He never stopped hoping you'd come back. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. What do you mean? My parents said he wanted nothing to do with us. That's not accurate, and I think you need to hear the full story. Your grandfather named you as the sole beneficiary of his will. His entire estate passes to you. I almost dropped my phone. That couldn't be right. My parents had 2 other children after we moved, my half-brother Marcus and half-sister Jennifer. They were in their mid-20s now, and from what little I'd heard through the grapevine, they lived comfortable lives funded by my parents' mysterious wealth. Surely Grandpa would have left something to them, or to my parents at least. What about my family? I asked, confusion mixing with old pain and a growing sense that something wasn't right about the story I'd been told my whole life. Your grandfather was very specific in his wishes, Ms. Reynolds said carefully. Perhaps we should discuss this in person. There are documents you need to see, recordings you need to hear. Can you fly to Montana tomorrow? The firm will cover all your expenses, including accommodations. I looked around the warehouse at the endless rows of inventory, at my supervisor who was already eyeing me suspiciously for taking too long on break. My life had been nothing but dead-end jobs and tiny apartments since my parents kicked me out at 19. They'd said I needed to understand the real world, that I'd been coddled too much and needed to learn independence. But the truth was they'd started a new family and I didn't fit into their plans anymore. I'd heard through a cousin that they'd moved into a mansion shortly after I left, though they'd always claimed to be struggling financially. I'll be there, I told her, my mind already racing with questions I didn't know how to answer. The flight to Montana gave me too much time to think. I'd tried over the years to contact my grandfather, sending letters to the ranch address I barely remembered. None of them were ever answered. I called information trying to get his phone number, but it was always unlisted. My parents had told me he'd probably thrown my letters away, that he was too bitter and angry to want contact with any of us. Eventually, I'd stopped trying, accepting that I'd lost my grandfather forever. The guilt of not pushing harder gnawed at me now that it was too late to make things right. Ms. Reynolds's law office was in a modern building overlooking the Yellowstone River. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. When I entered her office, she gestured to a comfortable chair and studied me for a moment before speaking. "You look just like him," she said softly. "Same eyes, same stubborn set to your jaw. He used to say you got that from him. Your grandfather spoke about you constantly. He never gave up hope that you'd find your way back to him, despite everything your parents did to prevent it." "But my parents said," I began, but she held up her hand. "I know what your parents said. Your grandfather knew too. That's why he took certain precautions over the years. What you're about to learn is going to be difficult, but you deserve the truth. She opened a large file and spread several documents across her desk. Your grandfather owned Blackwood Cattle Ranch, one of the largest and most profitable cattle operations in North America. The ranch encompasses 12,000 acres of prime grazing land in 3 counties, along with processing facilities, distribution networks, and significant real estate holdings throughout Montana and Wyoming. I stared at the papers, trying to make sense of the numbers swimming before my eyes. My parents had always described him as a small-time rancher barely scraping by, someone who chose his pride over helping his family when they needed it most. That was a lie, Ms. Reynolds said bluntly. One of many lies you were told. The ranch generates approximately $75 million in annual revenue. The total value of the estate, including land, livestock, equipment, facilities, and various investments, is valued at just over $2 billion. The room tilted and I gripped the arms of the chair to steady myself. $2 billion? With AB? Yes. And according to his will, executed 5 years ago and updated regularly until his death, you inherit everything. The ranch, the assets, the business operations, the investment portfolio, all of it. There are some smaller bequests to employees who've been with him for decades, and a charitable foundation he established, but the vast majority of the estate passes to you. This had to be a mistake. People like me didn't inherit empires. I was nobody, just another kid who'd been discarded when they became inconvenient. I'd spent the last 8 years bouncing between jobs, living in cramped apartments, eating ramen more nights than I cared to count. How could I possibly be the heir to billions? There's something else, Ms. Reynolds said, sliding a thick envelope across the desk. He left this for you. He wrote it 6 months ago when his health started declining. He wanted you to understand everything. The envelope was thick, my name written across the front in handwriting that triggered a flood of childhood memories. I could suddenly remember Grandpa teaching me to write my name, his large, weathered hand guiding my small one. I opened it with shaking hands, and his voice seemed to echo from the pages as I read. My dear grandchild, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've finally learned the truth. I need you to understand that losing you was the greatest pain of my life. Not losing your grandmother. Not any of the hardships I faced building this ranch. Nothing compared to the day you were taken from me. Your parents told you I pushed you away, but that's not what happened. Let me tell you the real story, the one they never wanted you to know. When your father brought your mother to the ranch 27 years ago, I welcomed her with open arms. I was so happy that my son had found someone, and I looked forward to having family around again. Your grandmother had passed away 2 years earlier, and the ranch felt empty without her. But your mother had expectations about what marrying into the Blackwood family would mean. She saw the ranch, saw the success we'd built, and assumed it meant unlimited money for whatever she wanted. Within months of their marriage, she was pressuring me to give them large sums of cash. She wanted a luxury car, expensive vacations, designer everything. When I explained that the ranch's money was tied up in operations and long-term investments, that we lived comfortably but not extravagantly, she became angry. She accused me of being cheap, of withholding from my own son. Your father, I'm sad to say, took her side. He'd never been interested in ranch work, and he started to resent that I wouldn't just hand over money for their lifestyle. Then you were born, and everything changed for me. You were the most beautiful baby I'd ever seen, and from the moment I held you, I knew you were special. You had your grandmother's spirit, curious about everything, fearless in the way only children can be. As you grew, you fell in love with the ranch just like I had as a boy. You wanted to help with everything, following me around from dawn to dusk, asking endless questions about the cattle, the land, the business. I started teaching you everything I knew, planning for the day when you'd take over. Your parents hated it. Your mother especially couldn't stand that you preferred spending time with me over the fancy toys she bought you. She wanted you to grow up sophisticated, as she put it, not covered in dirt and smelling like cattle. The arguments got worse over the years. She demanded I sign over portions of the ranch to them, claimed they deserved it for putting up with ranch life. When I refused, she threatened to take you away, to make sure I never saw you again. The breaking point came when you were 11. Your parents demanded I change my will to leave everything to them instead of you. They said you were too young to appreciate what I'd built, that they deserved it for raising you. When I told them the ranch would always go to you, that it was your birthright, your mother became vicious. She said terrible things, accused me of trying to steal you from them, threatened legal action. Your father backed her up on everything. I told them they were welcome to stay on the ranch, that there was plenty of room for all of us, but that my will wasn't changing. They left the next morning while I was out checking the north pastures, took you and everything they could pack into their cars, and disappeared. I came home to an empty house and a note saying they never wanted to hear from me again, that if I tried to contact them or you, they'd file for a restraining order. I hired private investigators immediately. I had to know where you were, that you were safe. They tracked you to California, where your parents had somehow purchased a very expensive house. I couldn't understand where the money came from until my lawyers discovered the truth. Your parents had stolen from me. Over the years they lived here, they'd been systematically embezzling from ranch accounts. Your mother had convinced your father to forge my signature on checks, to create fake vendor accounts, to skim money in ways they thought I'd never notice. By the time they left, they'd taken almost $3 million. I could have had them prosecuted, sent them to prison. But that would have meant you growing up with parents in jail, being put into foster care, losing everything. I couldn't do that to you, so I made a choice. I let them keep the money in exchange for them signing documents admitting what they'd done. Insurance against them ever coming back. But they were smart about one thing. They filed for a restraining order anyway, claiming I was dangerous and unstable. They lied to judges, produced fake evidence of threats I'd never made. My lawyers said fighting it would be difficult and expensive, and might make things worse for you if it looked like I was harassing your parents. So I kept my distance, at least officially. But I never stopped watching over you. I hired investigators to keep track of you over the years. I know about your childhood, how your parents essentially ignored you once they had Marcus and Jennifer. I know about the small apartment they made you live in while your siblings had huge bedrooms. I know about the public school they sent you to while your siblings went to private academies. I know that they made you get a job at 15 while your siblings got allowances. I watched from afar as you struggled, and it killed me that I couldn't help. When you turned 18 and they kicked you out, I almost intervened. My investigators said you were living in your car for 2 weeks before you found that tiny studio apartment. I wanted to send you money, to buy you a proper place to live, but my lawyers warned me that any contact could result in legal trouble, especially since your parents had renewed the restraining order multiple times. They said any financial gift could be seen as me trying to manipulate you, that your parents would use it against me in court. So I watched you struggle through jobs and hardships, and I documented everything. I kept files on every difficulty you faced, every time your parents could have helped but chose not to. I wanted you to know, when the time came, that none of this was your fault. You were a child caught in the middle of adult greed and manipulation. The ranch is yours now, as it always should have been. But I'm giving you more than property. I'm giving you the chance to build something meaningful, to create the life you deserve. Don't let anyone convince you that you're not worthy of this. You always were. I've left detailed instructions for Richard Cooper, my ranch manager. He's a good man who knows this operation inside and out. Trust him. He'll teach you everything you need to know. I've also left something else, evidence of everything your parents did. Recordings, documents, proof of their theft and their lies. You'll need it, because I guarantee they'll come for this inheritance the moment they hear about my death. Don't let them take from you what they don't deserve. All my love, Grandpa Samuel. I couldn't stop the tears as I finished reading. Everything I'd believed about my family, about myself, about why my life had been so hard, it had all been built on lies. Ms. Reynolds handed me a box of tissues and waited patiently while I composed myself. There's more, she said gently. Your grandfather left video recordings as well. Would you like to see them? I nodded, not trusting my voice. She turned on a screen mounted on her wall, and suddenly my grandfather was there, looking older and frielier than I remembered, but with eyes that were still sharp and full of love. Hello, sweetheart, his recorded voice said, and I started crying again at the old nickname. If you're watching this, Then Patricia has told you the truth about what happened. I wanted you to see my face, to hear my voice, to know that every word in that letter is true. I never stopped loving you. Not for one single day. The recording went on for almost an hour, my grandfather telling stories about my childhood that I'd almost forgotten, explaining the ranch operations, introducing me via video to key employees I'd need to know. He talked about his plans for the ranch's future, his hopes that I'd continue the legacy he'd built. At the end, his voice grew soft. I know this is overwhelming. I know you're probably scared and confused. But I believe in you. I always have. You have your grandmother's strength and your great-grandfather's instincts for the land. This ranch is in your blood, even if you've been away from it for years. Give yourself time to learn, to grow into this role. Don't let anyone, especially not your parents, make you feel like you don't deserve this. You do. More than anyone else in this world, you do. The screen went dark, and I sat in silence for a long moment. Ms. Reynolds spoke quietly. The drive to the ranch takes about 2 hours. Richard is expecting us. He's prepared the main house for you, and he's gathered the senior staff to meet you. Are you ready? I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready, but I nodded anyway. The drive through Montana countryside was breathtaking. Rolling hills gave way to mountains in the distance, and vast stretches of grassland dotted with cattle stretched as far as I could see. As we drove, Ms. Reynolds filled me in on more details about the estate. Your grandfather's investments were very smart. In addition to the ranch operations, he owned commercial real estate in Billings and Bozeman, agricultural equipment dealerships, and a significant stock portfolio. The ranch itself employs 235 people full-time, with an additional 100 seasonal workers during peak times. When we finally turned onto the property, marked by a massive wooden arch with the Blackwood Ranch brand burned into it, I understood why my grandfather had fought so hard to protect this place. The main drive was lined with white fencing that stretched into the distance, and the pastures beyond held more cattle than I'd ever seen in one place. Black Angus mostly, their dark coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. In the distance, I could see massive barns, equipment sheds, and what looked like an entire village of houses for the ranch workers. The main house sat on a hill overlooking the operation, a massive log structure that looked like something out of a Western dream. It was 3 stories tall with a wraparound porch, stone chimneys at each end, and large windows that reflected the Montana sky. A man in his 60s stood on the front steps, his weathered face breaking into a wide smile as our car approached. That's Richard, Ms. Reynolds said. He's been with your grandfather for 32 years. Started as a ranch hand and worked his way up to manager. Your grandfather trusted him completely. Richard's handshake was firm but warm, and his eyes were kind as he looked me over. You look just like your grandmother, he said. Samuel always said you had her spirit too. Welcome home. The words hit me harder than I expected. Home. I hadn't had a real home since I was 11 years old. The house was extraordinary inside. The main room had vaulted ceilings with exposed beams that had to be at least 40 feet high. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, large enough that I could have stood inside it. Leather furniture that looked both expensive and comfortable was arranged to take advantage of the massive windows overlooking the ranch. But what caught my attention were the photographs. They were everywhere, covering every available surface, hanging on every wall. Pictures of cattle, of ranch operations, of awards and championships spanning decades. And scattered throughout them all, pictures of me as a child. Me learning to ride. Me bottle feeding a calf. Me sitting on Grandpa's shoulders laughing. Me covered in mud but grinning from ear to ear. He never stopped loving you, Richard said quietly, watching me take it all in. Every decision he made was with you in mind. He used to stand right here, looking at these pictures, talking about the day you'd come home. Over the next several days, Richard showed me the full scope of the operation. The ranch wasn't just about raising cattle, though that was the core business. There were hay operations that produced feed for our own herd and for sale to other ranches. A state-of-the-art meat processing facility that prepared our beef for distribution. A transportation network with our own trucks that delivered to restaurants and stores across 6 states. Real estate investments that included shopping centers, office buildings, and residential developments. A breeding program that was recognized as one of the best in the country. We've got 250 employees across all operations, Richard explained as we toured the processing facility. Your grandfather treated every single one of them like family. That's why this place runs so well. People here don't just work for a paycheck. They work because they believe in what we're doing. The cattle themselves were magnificent. Black Angus primarily, with bloodlines that had been carefully developed over generations. Richard showed me the breeding records going back 40 years, explaining how certain genetic lines had been cultivated for specific traits. Some of the breeding bulls were worth over $200,000 each, their genetics so valuable that their semen was sold to ranches around the world. This is Thunder Ridge, Richard said, stopping at a pasture where a massive bull grazed peacefully. He's our top sire right now. His offspring have won championships across the country. He's worth about $300,000, but his genetic value is much higher. Your grandfather always said the quality of your herd determines the quality of your reputation. The processing facility was equally impressive. Modern, clean, and efficient, it processed not just our own cattle but also provided services for smaller ranches in the region. Your grandfather believed in helping the community, Richard explained. A lot of small operations can't afford their own processing facilities. We provide the service at cost, no markup. It builds goodwill and strengthens the entire industry in the region. The ranch offices were in a separate building, where a small army of accountants, logistics coordinators, and administrative staff kept the complex operation running smoothly. Richard introduced me to each department head, and I tried to remember names and roles while feeling completely overwhelmed. These folks are the backbone of the operation, Richard said. Your grandfather hired the best and paid them well. That's why we have almost no turnover. Over the next few weeks, I immersed myself in learning everything I could. Richard was patient with my endless questions, and the staff gradually warmed up to me as they saw I was genuinely interested in understanding the business, not just collecting profits. I started spending my days with different departments, learning the daily operations from the ground up. I worked with the ranch hands, helping to move cattle between pastures, mending fences, and checking water sources. I spent time in the processing facility, understanding the complex regulations and quality control measures. I sat in on meetings with buyers, learning the nuances of negotiating contracts and managing relationships. The business side was more challenging than I'd anticipated. I worked with accountants and financial advisors to understand our profit margins, operating costs, and investment strategies. The numbers were staggering. Some months we'd have expenses exceeding $5 million in feed, fuel, equipment maintenance, and employee salaries alone. But we were consistently profitable, generating the kind of returns that made those expenses manageable. I was also learning to ride again. It had been 15 years, but muscle memory was slowly returning. Richard was patient with me, teaching me not just how to handle a horse, but how to read the land, understand the cattle's behavior, and recognize the subtle signs that indicated problems before they became serious. Your grandfather always said you have to think like the cattle, Richard explained one morning as we rode through the north pastures. Understand what they need, what they fear, what drives their behavior. Once you understand that, managing them becomes intuitive. There was something magical about being in the saddle at sunrise, watching the mist rise from the valleys as the ranch came alive for another day. The land was beautiful in a way I'd forgotten, vast and wild and somehow eternal. I began to understand why my grandfather had fought so hard to protect it, why he'd never considered selling even when times were tough. This wasn't just a business. It was a legacy, a responsibility to the land and the animals and the people who depended on both. I found myself falling in love with the life despite its challenges. For the first time since childhood, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The ranch hands gradually accepted me as they saw I was willing to work hard and learn. The horses responded to my growing confidence. The cattle seemed to sense when I was nervous and when I was calm. This was home in a way nothing had been since I was 11 years old. But I knew the peace couldn't last. My parents had to have heard about the inheritance by now, and I knew they wouldn't let billions of dollars go without a fight. I was in the main barn checking on a cow that was about to calve when Richard appeared at my shoulder, his expression troubled. "We've got visitors at the main gate," he said quietly. "Your parents, along with your half-siblings and what looks like several attorneys. Multiple vehicles. They're demanding entry, saying they have legal business to discuss." My blood ran cold. I hadn't spoken to my parents in over 3 years, not since the brutal phone call where they told me I needed to stop being a burden and figure out my own life. I'd never even met Marcus and Jennifer face to face. They'd been young children when I'd left, and my parents had made sure we never connected. "What do they want?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "They're saying something about settling family business and discussing the estate." Richard's expression was grim. "I recorded everything at the gate like your grandfather instructed. They're not being subtle about their intentions. One of the attorneys specifically mentioned contesting the will." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. I'd known this moment would come eventually. Ms. Reynolds had warned me to expect it. But knowing something intellectually and facing it emotionally were very different things. "Let them in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But make sure all security systems are recording everything. Your grandfather had cameras and audio recorders installed throughout the main house and offices. Everything will be documented." 20 minutes later, I watched from the window of the main house as a convoy of 4 luxury SUVs wound up the drive. They drove slowly, as if taking inventory of everything they saw. My parents emerged from the first vehicle, and I barely recognized them. My mother had clearly had extensive cosmetic work done. Her face unnaturally smooth and her lips exaggerated. She wore what looked like a designer outfit that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. My father had the soft, pampered appearance of someone who hadn't done physical work in years. His expensive suit and perfect haircut a far cry from the struggling parent I remembered. Behind them came Marcus and Jennifer. Marcus was tall and athletically built, dressed in what looked like an expensive business casual outfit. Jennifer was polished and pretty in a calculated way, her outfit and makeup suggesting she'd spent considerable time preparing for this meeting. 3 attorneys in expensive suits rounded out the group, each carrying briefcases that probably cost thousands of dollars. They approached the house like they owned it, which I suppose they thought they should. I opened the door before they could knock, standing in the doorway with my arms crossed. "Hello, Mother. Father." I kept my voice neutral, determined not to show the emotion roiling inside me. My mother's eyes swept over me with obvious disdain, taking in my work boots, faded jeans, and the flannel shirt I'd been wearing in the barn. There was dirt under my fingernails and probably hay in my hair. "So this is where you've been hiding," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Playing cowboy with our inheritance." "Our inheritance?" I kept my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "The will was very clear. This belongs to me." My father pushed past me into the house without being invited, his eyes already cataloging everything of value. "We need to discuss this situation rationally. Your grandfather was clearly not in his right mind when he made these decisions. Obviously, the work of someone who'd lost his faculties." I followed them into the living room where they'd already made themselves comfortable on Grandpa's furniture, spreading out like they were settling in for a long siege. Marcus and Jennifer stood behind our parents, looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. Jennifer caught my eye briefly and looked away quickly, something like guilt crossing her face. The lead attorney, a thin man with gray hair and cold, calculating eyes, opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency. "I'm Douglas Hartford, representing your family in this matter. Let's address the elephant in the room. This will is obviously the result of undue influence and possibly elder abuse. My client's father was elderly, isolated, and vulnerable to manipulation by someone seeking to enrich themselves. My family?" I said incredulously. "These people haven't been my family since they threw me out with nothing 8 years ago." Mr. Hartford continued as if I hadn't spoken, his voice smooth and practiced. "Your grandfather was in his 80s, living alone, clearly in declining health. The fact that he left his entire estate to someone who hadn't been part of his life for years, while excluding his own son and grandchildren who could have cared for him, raises serious questions. You have no grounds, a voice said from behind me, and I turned to see Ms. Reynolds entering with two other attorneys I recognized from her firm. She set her briefcase down with a decisive click. Samuel Blackwood was evaluated by 4 independent physicians in the 6 months before his death. All confirmed he was of sound mind, under no duress whatsoever, and fully capable of making legal decisions. We have documentation of every evaluation, including cognitive tests that he passed with flying colors. Mr. Hartford's expression didn't change, though I saw his eyes narrow slightly. That doesn't address the fundamental issue of systematic alienation of this individual from their family, creating a situation where manipulation could occur over time. An elderly man, alone and bitter, influenced by someone seeking financial gain. The only alienation, Ms. Reynolds replied coolly, was orchestrated by your clients when they removed their child from this property 15 years ago and subsequently cut off all contact through fraudulent restraining orders and blocked communications. I have documentation of every attempt Mr. Blackwood made to contact his grandchild, all systematically blocked by your clients. My mother stood abruptly, her face flushing with anger beneath her too perfect skin. This is absurd. We're his family. We deserve our fair share of what he built. Your fair share? Richard had entered the room quietly, carrying a leather folder that looked old and well used. Let's talk about fair shares and what people actually deserve. He set the folder on the coffee table and opened it. These are copies of the 18 restraining order requests your clients filed against Samuel Blackwood over the years. All of them were denied because the judges recognized them for what they were, transparent attempts to prevent a grandfather from contacting his grandchild. He pulled out another document. This is a copy of the settlement agreement your client signed 12 years ago, admitting to embezzling nearly $3 million from ranch accounts. The room went silent. My father's face had gone from red to pale in seconds. That was, he started, but Richard cut him off. Documented and verified. Your wife created fake vendor accounts. You forged Samuel's signature on dozens of checks. The only reason you weren't prosecuted was because Samuel couldn't bear to see his grandchild lose both parents to prison. He let you keep the money in exchange for your written confession. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice uncertain and shocked. Embezzling? What is he talking about? We were told Grandpa was dangerous and irrational, that he didn't want anything to do with any of us. That's what you were told, Richard said, his voice gentler now as he addressed my half-siblings. It wasn't true. Not any of it. He pulled out another document. This is a record of every attempt Samuel made to contact all of you over the years. Letters returned unopened, phone calls blocked, birthday gifts sent back. He never stopped trying to be part of your lives. Jennifer's eyes were filling with tears. But Mom and Dad said, she started. Your parents lied, Ms. Reynolds said bluntly, about many things. They kept you from your grandfather specifically to position themselves as potential heirs. They cultivated the image of being the only family he had, all while preventing him from having any relationship with his grandchildren. My father found his voice again, though it shook with anger. You can't prove any of this would hold up in court. It's all circumstantial, designed to make us look bad. Actually, Richard said, walking to a cabinet I recognized from Grandpa's study, we have something much better than documents. We have recordings. Lots of them. Richard pulled out a digital storage device and connected it to the large screen mounted on the wall. Your grandfather started recording every conversation with your parents 12 years ago, after they threatened him. He knew someday this confrontation would come, and he wanted to make sure the truth was available. The screen flickered to life, showing the interior of Grandpa's study. The date stamp in the corner read 7 years ago. My grandfather sat in his leather chair, looking older than I remembered but still strong and alert. The door opened and my parents entered, their younger faces still showing the same calculating expressions they wore now. Samuel, we need to talk about your will, my father said without preamble or greeting. There's nothing to discuss, my grandfather replied, his voice firm. My will is my business and mine alone. That ranch should belong to the family, my mother interjected, her voice sharp. We've sacrificed everything to build our life. We deserve to benefit from all those years we spent on that miserable property. What sacrifice? My grandfather's voice grew hard. You lived in my house rent-free, drove vehicles I paid for, and the entire time you were stealing from ranch accounts. The only reason you're not in prison is because I put my grandchild's welfare above my own anger. And as for sacrifice, you left of your own accord when I wouldn't give you access to money you hadn't earned. That child you're so obsessed with, my mother said, her voice dripping with venom, was a burden then and would be a burden now. Worthless and needy just like at 11 years old. All they ever did was follow you around and get in the way. We did you a favor by taking them away. A mistake we're willing to correct by ensuring this estate goes where it belongs. To us. Never, my grandfather said, and even through the recording I could hear the steel in his voice. Everything I've built is for my grandchild. You've already proven you can't be trusted with family, let alone with this legacy. That child is worth 1,000 of you. You'll regret this, old man, my father said, his voice cold with threat. We'll make sure you die alone and forgotten. We'll contest anything you leave to that worthless kid. We'll tie it up in courts for years. We'll threaten me all you want, my grandfather interrupted. It won't change anything. Now get out of my house and don't come back. The recording ended, leaving the room in stunned silence. I felt like I'd been simultaneously validated and gutted. Hearing my mother call me a burden so casually, with such vicious certainty, was devastating even though I'd suspected it for years. But hearing Grandpa defend me, call me worth 1,000 of them, made my heart ache with loss for all the years we could have had together. There are dozens of these recordings, Richard said quietly into the silence. Phone calls, in-person visits, threats, demands for money. Your grandfather documented everything because he knew this day would come. He knew they'd try to take everything from you, and he wanted you to have ammunition to fight back. Ms. Reynolds opened her own briefcase. I also have copies of all recordings, along with the financial records proving the embezzlement, evidence that the restraining orders were obtained through perjury, and testimony from 3 different private investigators your grandfather hired to document your parents' activities over the years. If you proceed with contesting this will, all of this becomes public record in court. Mr. Hartford was frantically whispering with my parents, and I could see the defeat starting to settle into their postures. The recordings had destroyed any sympathy they might have garnered from a judge. More than that, they'd exposed them as exactly what they were. Marcus was staring at our parents like he'd never seen them before. Jennifer was crying quietly, her careful makeup starting to run. You lied to us, Marcus said, his voice shaking. About everything. About Grandpa, about your grandfather loved you both, Richard said gently. He wanted relationships with you. Your parents made sure that never happened. He pulled out 2 more envelopes. He left letters for both of you. Smaller bequests, trust funds he set up years ago. He never forgot any of his grandchildren, even the ones he never got to know. My mother turned on Richard with pure fury in her eyes. You have no right to interfere in family business. This is between us and that ungrateful brat we wasted years raising. I'm not here as an employee, Richard said calmly. I'm here as executor of Samuel's will, a role he gave me specifically because he trusted me to make sure his wishes were followed. And his wishes were very clear. Everything goes to his grandchild, the one he raised and loved, not the one who stole from him and lied for years. My father stood abruptly, gesturing angrily at the room. This is ridiculous. We're not going to sit here and be ambushed with lies and manipulation. You're not being ambushed, I said, finding my voice again after the shock of the recordings. You're being held accountable for the first time in your lives. For abandoning me, for lying about Grandpa, for stealing from him, for keeping all of us apart. This is just the truth finally coming to light. My mother turned on me with vicious fury, her perfectly made-up face contorting into something ugly. You think you're so smart now, don't you? Living in this big house, playing rancher with expensive cattle. But you're still the same worthless child you always were. Needy, pathetic, not worth the effort it took to raise you. We should have given you up the day you were born. Her words hit their intended target, cutting deep into old wounds. But something had changed in me over the past weeks. I wasn't the scared, abandoned teenager anymore. I was the owner of Blackwood Ranch, the inheritor of my grandfather's legacy. And I had people who believed in me, who'd shown me in weeks more care than my parents had in years. You're right about one thing, I said, my voice calmer than I felt. I am the same person I always was. Someone who values loyalty, hard work, and treating people with respect. Qualities you never bothered to teach me because you don't possess them yourselves. How dare you, my father started, his face reddening again. How dare I what? Tell the truth? You abandoned your child, lied about your own father, stole from him, and now you're trying to steal an inheritance that was never meant for you. The only thing surprising about this situation is that you actually thought you'd get away with it. Richard stepped closer, his presence reassuring and solid. I think it's time for these folks to leave. You've seen the evidence. You know you have no legal standing. If you pursue this, you'll only embarrass yourselves publicly and waste money on legal fees. Mr. Hartford, I'd suggest you counsel your clients accordingly. Mr. Hartford gathered his papers hastily, his professional composure cracking. This isn't over. We'll be filing challenges to the will, investigating the circumstances of the inheritance, looking into every aspect of how this estate was managed. We'll find something. Feel free, Ms. Reynolds said, her voice cold and confident. I welcome the scrutiny. It will only further demonstrate your client's pattern of manipulation, greed, and fraud. Every document will show Samuel Blackwood was a shrewd businessman who managed his affairs impeccably. Every witness will testify to his sound mind and clear intentions. You'll find nothing but more evidence of your client's malfeasance. My parents headed for the door, but my mother turned back one last time, her eyes full of cold certainty. You'll fail, she said. You have no education, no training, no experience with this kind of operation. When this ranch collapses under your incompetence, and it will, don't come crawling back to us for help. We're done with you. I wouldn't dream of it, I replied. You've made it abundantly clear over the years that I'm not part of your family. The difference is now I have a real family. People who actually care about me and believe in me. Marcus and Jennifer hesitated at the door, looking torn between their parents and something else. Maybe curiosity, maybe regret. Jennifer turned back, tears still streaming down her face. The letters Grandpa left for us, she said quietly. Can we have them? Of course, I said. Richard handed them each an envelope. Grandpa wanted you to have them. Whatever our parents did, he never blamed you for it. You were children, just like I was. Marcus took his envelope with shaking hands. We really didn't know any of it. They told us you were angry and bitter, that you blamed us for them leaving the ranch. They said Grandpa had become dangerous and paranoid. I believe you, I said. Our parents are very good at lying. The trust funds, Marcus said. Are those real? Very real, Ms. Reynolds confirmed. Your grandfather established them 10 years ago. $50,000 each, invested conservatively. They've grown to about $75,000 each now. He wanted to make sure you had something, even if he never got to know you. Jennifer wiped her eyes, smearing mascara across her cheeks. Would it be possible to talk sometime? Without them? She gestured toward our parents who were already at their vehicles. I'd like to hear about Grandpa, to understand what really happened. I'd like that, I said honestly. You're my siblings. I'd like to get to know you. They left then, following our parents but slower, looking back at the ranch with something like longing. After everyone was gone, I collapsed into Grandpa's favorite leather chair, emotionally drained. Richard sat across from me, his weathered face kind but serious. Tom poured us both whiskey from a decanter on the sideboard. You okay, kid? He asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure that was entirely true. Hearing my mother say those things, even though I knew she was cruel, it still hurt. Of course it does, Richard said. She's your mother. Part of you will always want her approval, want her to love you the way a parent should. But you need to understand that her inability to love you properly isn't a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of her character or lack thereof. Did Grandpa really record everything? Every conversation, Richard confirmed. He was a smart man. After they stole from him and took you away, he knew they'd eventually come back for more. He prepared for this day meticulously. The recordings, the documents, the medical evaluations proving his sound mind. He wanted to make sure you'd be protected. The weeks following my parents' visit were challenging but also strangely liberating. Their legal challenges were filed as threatened, but they were quickly dismissed once the court reviewed the evidence. The judge's ruling was scathing, noting that the will was one of the most ironclad he'd ever seen and that the challengers' claims bordered on frivolous. He warned their attorneys that any further challenges would result in sanctions. The local newspaper got wind of the story somehow, and while they didn't print names, the details were clear enough. Public opinion in the ranching community turned decisively against my parents. People who'd known my grandfather rallied around me, offering support and assistance. But the confrontation had planted seeds of doubt that grew in quiet moments. Was I really capable of running such a massive operation? Did I deserve this inheritance? Or was I just lucky? What if my mother was right and I'd run the place into the ground within a year? I threw myself into learning everything I could, determined to prove I belonged here. I spent long hours with the veterinarians, understanding the complexities of cattle health, breeding genetics, and nutrition. I studied bloodlines that went back generations, learning to recognize the subtle traits that made certain cattle exceptional. The breeding program was an art as much as a science, requiring an understanding of genetics, market demands, and long-term planning. The financial side remained daunting. I worked closely with the accountants to understand our profit margins, our operating expenses, and our investment strategies. The ranch wasn't just about the cattle. It was a sophisticated business empire that required careful management across multiple sectors. I learned about futures markets and how to hedge against price fluctuations. I studied feed costs and how weather patterns in other parts of the country could affect our bottom line. But it was the cattle themselves and the land they grazed on that truly captured my heart. Each animal had value not just in dollars but in its place within our carefully maintained bloodlines. I began to understand what Grandpa had meant about putting them first. When you took care of the cattle and the land properly, the profits followed naturally. I started spending my mornings doing physical ranch work alongside the hands, mending fences, checking water sources, helping move cattle between pastures. My body ached in ways it never had from warehouse work, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from meaningful labor. The ranch hands noticed my commitment and their respect grew. "Your grandfather would be proud," Richard told me one evening as we watched the sunset from the main house porch. "You've got his instincts for this work, his way of reading the land and understanding the cattle. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just fooling myself," I admitted, "like I'm playing a role and eventually everyone will realize I have no idea what I'm doing." Richard was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "You know what your grandfather used to say? The land doesn't care about your past or your doubts. It only cares about what you're willing to give it today. You're not fooling anyone. You're learning, you're working hard, and you're making good decisions. That's all any of us can do." 3 months into my ownership of Blackwood Ranch, Marcus and Jennifer reached out, asking to meet without our parents' knowledge. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in town, neutral territory where we could just talk without the weight of the ranch or the family drama hanging over us. "I need you to know," Jennifer said as soon as we sat down, "that we had no idea what they'd done. Any of it. The embezzling, the lies about Grandpa, how they treated you. They told us you'd chosen to leave, that you wanted nothing to do with family life." Marcus nodded, his expression pained. "When we got older and started asking questions about you, they got defensive. Said you'd made your choices and we needed to respect your privacy. They made it seem like bringing you up upset them because you'd rejected the family." "The lies ran so deep," I said. "They'd built an entire alternate history." We spent hours talking that day, sharing our experiences, filling in the gaps of our separate lives. They'd grown up in wealth, but under the controlling influence of parents who used money as leverage for obedience. Every privilege came with strings attached. Every gift had expectations. They'd been raised to believe their worth was tied to their achievements and their compliance. I'd grown up with nothing material, but at least I'd been free to become my own person, to make my own choices without the weight of parental manipulation. By the end of the conversation, we'd agreed to stay in touch. They weren't responsible for our parents' choices, and they seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me and learning about the ranch. Over the following months, they became regular visitors to Blackwood. Jennifer had studied marketing and business, and she was fascinated by the ranch's operations. Marcus had a degree in environmental science and was particularly interested in our grazing management and land conservation efforts. They weren't looking for money or ownership. They seemed to genuinely want to connect with the grandfather they'd never known through the legacy he'd left behind. "Your grandfather left us letters," Jennifer told me during one visit, pulling out a worn envelope. "I've read mine probably 100 times. He wrote about regret, about wishing he could have known us, about hoping that someday we'd learn the truth. It makes me so angry at them, at our parents, for stealing that from us. We could have known him. We could have had this in our lives." I showed them around the ranch, sharing stories Richard had told me about Grandpa, showing them the photo albums he'd kept, letting them see the man they'd been denied the chance to know. It was healing for all of us in different ways. They were discovering a grandfather they'd never met. I was discovering I had siblings who weren't like our parents. The ranch kept me busy, but I was beginning to truly understand its rhythms and patterns. Spring meant calving season, when we'd work around the clock to ensure the safe delivery of hundreds of calves. Summer was for moving cattle to high pastures and preparing for market. Fall brought weaning and shipping. Winter was for maintenance and planning for the next year. Each season had its demands and its rewards. I was also learning about the community beyond the ranch. Grandpa had been respected not just for his business success but for his integrity and his willingness to help other ranchers. He'd served on agricultural boards, mentored young ranchers, and used his influence to advocate for policies that helped the entire industry. Richard introduced me to other ranch owners, to cattle buyers, to the network of relationships that made the business work. They were cautious at first, wondering if I'd maintain the Blackwood reputation for quality and reliability. But as they saw my commitment and my willingness to learn, they began to accept me as Grandpa's legitimate successor. 6 months into my ownership, I faced my first major crisis. A severe drought was threatening the entire region, and our water sources were running dangerously low. The ranch hands were worried, and I could see the concern in Richard's eyes even though he tried to project confidence. "We need to make a decision about the south pastures," he said one morning over coffee. "We can either sell off part of the herd now to reduce our water needs and preserve our best breeding stock, or we can drill new wells. But drilling is expensive, there's no guarantee we'll find water at useful depths, and it'll take time. If we wait too long and don't find water, we could lose cattle." I spent sleepless nights reviewing our options, consulting with hydrologists, studying geological surveys, and running financial projections. Selling cattle would provide immediate relief and cash flow, but it would damage our breeding program and our reputation for maintaining consistent herd quality. It would take years to rebuild what we'd lose. Drilling wells was a massive financial risk. Each well could cost up to $200,000, and there was no guarantee of success. But if we found water, we'd be better positioned for future droughts and could even help neighboring ranches that were struggling. I thought about what Grandpa would do. He'd built this ranch by thinking long-term, by investing in infrastructure and never compromising his standards for short-term gain. But he'd also been practical, understanding when cutting losses was smarter than stubborn persistence. I called a meeting with Richard and the senior staff. "We're going to drill," I announced. 3 new wells in strategic locations based on the geological surveys. "We'll go deep if we have to, down to the aquifer level. It's a risk, but it's an investment in the ranch's future and in our ability to weather crises like this. But, and this is important, if after 2 wells we haven't found viable water, we reassess. I won't gamble the entire operation on stubbornness." Richard smiled slightly. "Your grandfather would have made the same choice." The drilling began immediately, and for 2 agonizing weeks we watched as the first well went deeper and deeper with no sign of water. The tension on the ranch was palpable. Everyone knew what was at stake. Then, at just over 800 feet, the drillers hit an aquifer. The water that came up was clean, cold, and abundant. The second and third wells were equally successful, and within a month we had a water system that could sustain the ranch through even the worst drought projections. But I made another decision that surprised everyone. "We're going to share," I announced at a community meeting of local ranchers. Any ranch in the area that needs water can access our wells. We'll only charge enough to cover the electrical costs of pumping. No profit, no restrictions. There was stunned silence. Then one of the older ranchers, a man who'd known my grandfather for 40 years, stood up. Samuel would have done the same thing, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He always said we're stronger together than we are competing. You're your grandfather's grandchild, no doubt about it. The decision cemented my reputation in the ranching community. We weren't just successful. We were good neighbors, the kind of operation that strengthened everyone around us. When the drought finally broke months later, we were better positioned than we'd been before, and we'd earned goodwill that money couldn't buy. As my first year at Blackwood Ranch drew to a close, I realized I wasn't just maintaining Grandpa's legacy. I was building something new on the foundation he'd left me. The ranch was thriving financially, but I wanted it to mean something more, to have a purpose beyond just profit. I started several new initiatives, programs that I knew Grandpa would have supported. First was a mentorship program for young ranchers, providing education, resources, and guidance to help them get started. The industry was aging, and we needed new blood with new ideas. Second was a partnership with Montana State University to study sustainable grazing practices and climate adaptation strategies. We opened our land as a living laboratory, helping advance knowledge that could benefit ranchers everywhere. Third was an employee profit-sharing system that gave every worker on the ranch a stake in its success. Grandpa had paid well, but I wanted people to feel ownership, to know that their hard work directly benefited them. The response was overwhelming, and our productivity increased even as our workplace culture became more collaborative and positive. But the program closest to my heart was one inspired by my own experience. I established a foundation for young people aging out of foster care, providing scholarships, job training, and mentorship opportunities. Some came to work on the ranch learning skills that could lead to careers in agriculture. Others received support for education or starting businesses. All of them got what I'd needed desperately at their age. Someone who believed in them and invested in their future. The first group of scholarship recipients arrived on a cold October morning. 6 young people between 18 and 22. All of them carrying the same wariness and hope I'd felt at their age. I met them at the main house, suddenly nervous about whether I could actually help them. "Welcome to Blackwood Ranch," I said. "I know what it's like to age out of foster care with nothing. I know what it's like to feel like the world doesn't care if you succeed or fail. This program exists because someone believed in me when I had nothing, and I want to pay that forward. You're not charity cases. You're investments in the future." Over the following months, I watched them transform. Working with the cattle and the land gave them purpose. Learning valuable skills gave them confidence. Being part of the ranch community showed them what healthy relationships looked like. One young woman named Sarah, who'd been bounced between 12 foster homes, discovered a gift for working with animals and was now training to be a veterinary technician. A young man named James, who'd aged out while homeless, found his calling in the mechanical side of ranch operations and was taking courses in diesel mechanics. "You're changing lives," Jennifer told me one day as we watched the scholarship students working with some of the gentler cattle. "Your grandfather built something amazing, but you're making it mean something more. He gave you a ranch. You're giving people hope." The ranch was more profitable than ever. The breeding program was producing exceptional cattle that commanded premium prices. The processing facility was operating at capacity. The real estate investments were generating steady returns. But profit wasn't the only measure of success anymore. We were creating opportunities, strengthening communities, and proving that business success and social responsibility weren't mutually exclusive. Marcus had become a regular consultant on our environmental initiatives, and his research on our grazing patterns was earning attention in academic circles. Jennifer had helped us develop a direct-to-consumer platform that connected customers with the source of their food, telling the story of sustainable ranching and ethical animal husbandry. My half-siblings had found their own connection to the ranch and to Grandpa's legacy, creating something new from what could have been permanent estrangement. My parents made one final attempt to contact me about a year after the will was settled. They sent a letter through their attorney requesting a meeting to discuss. As they put it, a reasonable financial settlement that would allow the family to move forward. They offered to drop all legal claims and cease any negative comments in exchange for a $25 million payment. I read the letter in Grandpa's study, now fully my own space, surrounded by the photos and memories he'd preserved. $25 million would have seemed like an impossible fortune just a year and a half ago. Now it felt like an insult, a final attempt to profit from the relationship they'd destroyed and the inheritance they'd tried to steal. I had Ms. Reynolds draft a simple response. No settlement, no payment, no contact. All legal matters were resolved in court. I have no interest in any further relationship. The door you closed 15 years ago when you took me from my grandfather remains closed by your own choice. I wish you well, but at a distance. The letter was sent, and I never heard from them again. I'd heard through community gossip that they'd burned through most of the money they'd embezzled, their lifestyle of luxury outpacing even their substantial theft. They'd apparently moved out of state, chasing other opportunities. I felt nothing about their departure. No anger, no satisfaction, just a vague sense of relief that they were finally truly gone from my life. Standing on the porch of the main house as my second spring at the ranch began, I watched the sun rise over land that now felt completely like home. The herd was healthy and growing. The business was strong and expanding. The scholarship program was in its second year with a waiting list of applicants. I was surrounded by people who'd become my chosen family: Richard, the ranch staff, my scholarship students, even Marcus and Jennifer, who visited regularly and had become genuine friends. Richard joined me with 2 cups of coffee, handing me one as we watched the ranch come alive for another day. This had become our routine, these quiet morning moments before the day's chaos began. Your grandfather would be proud of what you've built here, he said. I'm not sure I've built anything, I replied. I'm just trying to honor what he started. That's where you're wrong, Richard said firmly. Your grandfather built a successful ranch. You're building something bigger, a legacy that's about more than money or cattle. You're creating opportunity, fostering community, changing lives. That's what real legacy looks like. The scholarship students were already up, heading toward the barns for morning chores. Their transformation over the months never ceased to amaze me. They'd arrived broken and wary. Now they walked with purpose and confidence. Sarah waved as she passed, heading toward the veterinary facilities. James was already at the equipment barn, probably tinkering with one of the tractors he'd taken upon himself to restore. Tomorrow we'd welcome another group of retired breeding cattle from a ranch that was shutting down, giving them peaceful final years in our pastures. Next week we'd host a field day for local schools, teaching kids about sustainable agriculture. Next month we'd break ground on a new training facility for the scholarship program. The ranch was alive with purpose and possibility. I thought about my parents occasionally, usually when I was writing checks for the scholarship program or watching one of the students discover their potential. I wondered if they ever regretted their choices, if they ever thought about the grandchild they'd abandoned or the father they'd betrayed. But mostly I felt grateful for the path that had led me here, painful as it had been. Their abandonment had been devastating, but it had also freed me from their toxicity, allowing me to discover who I really was without their constant criticism and manipulation. The ranch had taught me that legacy isn't just about what you inherit. It's about what you do with what you're given, how you honor the past while building for the future. Grandpa hadn't just left me property and money. He'd left me the opportunity to become the person I was meant to be, to create something meaningful, to make a difference in ways I'd never imagined possible. As the sun climbed higher, warming the Montana morning air, I finished my coffee and headed toward the barns. There was work to do, decisions to make, a future to build. The ranch demanded nothing less than everything I had to give: my time, my energy, my commitment, my heart. But unlike the conditional love my parents had offered, full of judgment and manipulation, the ranch asked only for honest effort and respect for the land, the animals, and the people who depended on both. It gave back purpose, community, family, and the unshakable knowledge that I belonged somewhere in this world. The cattle were already moving toward the feeding areas, their routine as reliable as the sunrise. The horses in the nearby pasture nickered as I passed, recognizing me now as part of their daily landscape. The land itself seemed to welcome each new day, resilient and eternal, ready for whatever challenges came next. I joined the ranch hands gathering near the equipment barn, no longer the uncertain newcomer but a full member of the team and, in fact, their leader. They'd seen me learn from mistakes, make tough decisions, and prove my commitment to this life. They'd watched me transform from someone who didn't know a fence stretcher from a cattle prod into someone who could run a $2 billion operation with confidence and competence. "Morning, boss," one of the senior hands called out, and I smiled at the title I'd finally grown comfortable with. Not boss really, but steward, guardian of a legacy my grandfather had built and I was privileged to continue. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It means more than you know that you've taken this journey with me, from confusion and uncertainty to finding my true home and purpose at Blackwood Ranch. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please share where you're listening from, whether it's a farm, a ranch, a city apartment, or anywhere in between. Tell me about your own experiences with family, with finding where you belong, with building something meaningful. Your stories and perspectives always inspire me and remind me why sharing these experiences matters. And if this story resonated with you, if it touched something in your own journey or gave you hope that circumstances can change, please consider subscribing. There are so many more stories to share about finding your place in the world, about overcoming obstacles, about building the life you deserve despite the hand you were dealt. I believe in the power of stories to connect us, to show us we're not alone in our struggles, and to inspire us to keep pushing forward even when the path seems impossible. Until next time, remember that the family that chooses you, that earns your trust through actions rather than demanding it through obligation, that believes in you when you can't believe in yourself, that's the family that matters most. And remember that your worth isn't determined by the people who couldn't see it. It's determined by what you do with the opportunities you're given and how you lift others up along the way. Take care of yourselves and each other. Keep working toward your dreams. And never forget that sometimes the most painful chapters of our lives lead us exactly where we need to be.